In the Valley of Mexico, a riddle lingers. How did a people once dismissed as wanderers forge one of the most formidable empires in the Americas? Rising from lakes and volcanic highlands, the Mexica, later called the Aztecs, built cities on water, mapped the heavens with precision, and commanded armies that stretched their dominion across mountains and coasts. Their stone temples still stand, etched with the blood of sacrifice and the whispers of vanished gods. Yet this civilization's lifespan was astonishingly brief, collapsing in less than 2 centuries beneath the weight of war, plague, and conquest. What explains such a meteoric arc, its brilliance and its fragility? In this journey, we follow the Aztec world from mythic migrations to the ruins beneath modern Mexico City, asking, what survives of their empire today? Hidden in festivals, language, and memory, the answers unfold, chapter by chapter. The story of the Aztec Empire does not begin with pyramids rising over Lake Texcoco. It begins in harsher lands, hundreds of kilometers to the north, where the sun bakes the desert floor and water lies hidden in sparse springs. From these arid reaches came the Mexica, later called the Aztecs. Their beginnings were obscure, their path uncertain, but their destiny would alter the map of an entire continent. Most traditions place their ancestral homeland in a place known as Aztlán, a land both geographical and mythical. Its location remains debated. Some scholars point toward the deserts of modern-day Nayarit or Zacatecas. Others imagine a symbolic origin beyond precise coordinates. The Mexica themselves preserved its memory through song and codex, describing an island home surrounded by water, from which their people were commanded by the god Huitzilopochtli to depart. Why abandon such a place? The sources disagree. Some describe famine, others divine decree. What unites the stories is movement, a people wandering, carrying gods in portable shrines, sustained by ritual, hunting, and whatever crops the soil permitted. Their migration began, by most reckonings, in the 12th century CE. Already we sense a paradox. The Mexica were heirs to older traditions yet marked as outsiders. They would arrive in the Valley of Mexico as newcomers, strangers at the gates of cities with deep histories. Yet, it was precisely this marginality that hardened them. Archaeological evidence, though fragmentary, provides glimpses of these early centuries. Pottery styles found along migration routes echo Toltec motifs, while obsidian tools bear resemblance to those of the Chichimec peoples. Linguistically, the Mexica spoke Nahuatl, placing them within a wider Uto-Aztecan family that had spread southward over centuries. This heritage bound them to nomadic warriors of the desert, skilled with bows, atlatls, and guerrilla tactics. Their worldview was carried in ritual. Priests watched the sky, charting the movements of Venus and the sun, binding migration to celestial order. Fires were lit, hearts offered, and omens interpreted. For the Mexica, each step was part of a cosmic choreography. The people moved because the gods commanded, and yet, survival demanded more than faith. Families hauled reed mats and grinding stones. Hunters tracked deer and rabbits. Women pounded maize where they found it, mixing it with chilies gathered in the wild. Life was portable, labor relentless. Children grew up in the dust of the trail, learning that their community's existence hinged on discipline and cohesion. How far could such a people travel? And what would they find when the deserts gave way to fertile valleys already claimed by others? By the 13th century, the Mexica reached the southern basin of Mexico, a high-altitude plateau surrounded by volcanic mountains, punctuated by a sprawling system of interconnected lakes. The contrast with their northern homelands was dramatic. Here, water was abundant, soils rich, and city-states prosperous. But opportunity was paired with exclusion. The Valley of Mexico was no blank slate. It had been home to great civilizations for centuries. Teotihuacan, long abandoned but still looming as a city of the gods. And more recently, Toltec's successors, whose prestige defined legitimacy. By the time the Mexica arrived, Altepetl, city-states like Culhuacan, Texcoco, and Azcapotzalco controlled the lakeshore. Each claimed noble lineages, each guarded farmland and canals with vigilance. Into this crowded arena came the Mexica. Landless migrants, clad in humble garb, speaking a dialect mocked as coarse. They had no ancestral estates, no dynastic prestige to secure them a place. Chroniclers note they were called Chichimeca, a word that evoked both wildness and disdain. Where could such people fit in a world already ordered by lineage and law? At first, survival meant service. The Mexica hired themselves as mercenaries, their martial ferocity making them valuable to established rulers. They carried obsidian blades into battle, fought in disciplined ranks, and quickly earned reputations as ruthless warriors. Yet this reputation was double-edged. Admired for courage, feared for brutality, never fully trusted. Their settlements in these early years were precarious. Huts along marshy fringes, reed platforms rising from mud. Food was meager: fish, frogs, insects, maize purchased or won through toil. Still, ritual never ceased. Shrines of earth and wood honored Huitzilopochtli, the patron of war, and Tlaloc, lord of rain. Festivals stitched community together, music and sacrifice binding the people to their gods. It is here that the prophecy gained sharper focus. The Mexica believed their wanderings would end when they saw a sign: an eagle perched upon a cactus, devouring a serpent. This vision, promised by Huitzilopochtli, would reveal the destined site of their city. Until then, every camp was temporary, every foothold provisional. Would such a sign ever appear, or were they condemned to remain outsiders forever? Their search intersected with constant tension. Culhuacan, one of the basin's prominent Altepetl, alternately employed and rejected the Mexica. One account recalls a disastrous episode. Invited to settle near Culhuacan, the Mexica offended their hosts by offering human sacrifices in unfamiliar rituals. Outrage forced them out, once again displaced. These failures etched a lesson. Legitimacy could not simply be borrowed. It had to be forged. But how could a landless people craft authority in a world ruled by dynasties that claimed descent from gods? The answer, in part, lay in the forging of identity. On their long migrations, the Mexica had already learned resilience. Now, in the hostile politics of the valley, they deepened their cohesion. They codified laws, clarified social ranks, and elevated warriors whose valor on the battlefield gave them status. Each step prepared them for the possibility of sovereignty, even as they remained at the mercy of greater powers. Meanwhile, everyday life reflected both hardship and ingenuity. Women spun cotton into cloth, often traded for food. Men labored in service to neighboring rulers, receiving maize rations as pay. Children trained early in discipline, boys with miniature bows, girls at grinding stones. Community feasts, though sparse, affirmed bonds. In every detail, the Mexica sustained themselves through adaptation, pragmatic, disciplined, enduring. Still, the larger question loomed. Could a people scorned as barbarians ever become rulers of the very valley that mocked them? By the early 14th century, the Mexica had reached the swampy shallows of Lake Texcoco itself. Here, they faced perhaps their most daunting environment yet. Unstable islands of reeds and mud, far from the fertile Chinampa zones already claimed by rivals. To most, such terrain seemed useless. To the Mexica, desperate for land, it was a canvas. They drove stakes into muck, layered soil and reeds, and began building artificial plots, primitive precursors of the great Chinampas that would later sustain an empire. Their huts clustered on raised ground, surrounded by water alive with fish and birds. Hunger still stalked them, but so did determination. And then, according to tradition, came the vision. On a small islet, they saw the eagle, perched on a prickly pear cactus, devouring a serpent. This was no ordinary omen. It was the culmination of prophecy, the signal that their wandering had ended. The eagle's sign transformed a fragile settlement into a destiny. The Mexica called their new home Tenochtitlan, place of the prickly pear cactus on the stone. Founded around 1325 CE, it was at first nothing more than a scattering of huts and reed canoes. Yet within a century, it would become a metropolis of canals, pyramids, and palaces. Their odyssey from northern deserts to Lake Island settlement reveals the paradox at the heart of Aztec origins. A people forged in marginality, hardened by rejection, sustained by faith, and guided by vision. But destiny carried a burden. To thrive, they would have to navigate the power struggles of the Valley of Mexico, alliances, wars, and betrayals. Their survival depended not only on divine prophecy, but on political cunning. The eagle had appeared. The city was founded, but could the Mexica transform prophecy into power? The Valley of Mexico in the early 14th century was no wilderness. It was a crowded arena of rival powers, each city-state, Altepetl, defending its lineage, its fields, and its honor. At its heart lay Lake Texcoco, a vast, shallow inland sea ringed with volcanic slopes and fertile plains. Its waters shimmered beneath the sun, its islands and peninsulas crowded with towns that had histories stretching back centuries. Into this basin came the Mexica, wanderers from the northern deserts, hardened by years of displacement but still strangers. They had no ancestral claim, no noble dynasty, no fertile estates to fall back upon. What they possessed were their gods, their discipline, and a prophecy still unfulfilled. The valley was not a single kingdom, but a patchwork. Culhuacan to the south boasted Toltec lineage, a pedigree that conferred immense prestige. To the west, Azcapotzalco commanded Tepanec warriors and a web of tributaries. Texcoco, to the east, flourished as a center of learning and power. Between and beyond lay dozens of smaller polities, each guarding its chinampas, its temples, its ancestral rites. Resources here were precious. Farmland around the lakes was carefully parcelled. Irrigation canals directed water with precision. Fishermen harvested axolotls, carp, and waterfowl. Salt pans along the shore yielded white crystals that became essential trade goods. Control of land and water meant survival, and every Altepetl guarded its share fiercely. Into this already crowded system walked the Mexica, asking not for trade, but for land. They were received with suspicion. Chroniclers describe them as ragged, ill-fed, and barbarous, their language marked by harsh accents. Some called them chichimeca, a term that implied wildness. Yet others recognized their value. Mercenaries willing to fight, to shed blood in service of their hosts. Would these outsiders find a permanent home, or only temporary refuge? At first, survival meant submission. The Mexica offered their arms to Culhuacan, one of the basin's oldest cities. As hired warriors, they fought against neighboring rivals, earning a reputation for ferocity. Their macuahuitl, edged with obsidian blades, struck fear into enemies. Their discipline on the battlefield made them sought-after allies. But admiration did not erase disdain. The Mexica lacked noble pedigree. They had no marriage alliances tying them to the Toltec past. For Culhuacan's rulers, they were useful, but expendable. An incident, preserved in later codices, reveals how fragile this relationship was. The Mexica requested a Culhua princess to marry their leader and to sanctify their connection to legitimacy. The princess was sent, but in a shocking turn, the Mexica sacrificed her, skinning her body in a ritual to honor their god, Huitzilopochtli. When her father discovered the truth, outrage ignited. Culhuacan's warriors turned on the Mexica, driving them from their temporary refuge. Exiled once again, the Mexica wandered the edges of Lake Texcoco, outcasts among civilizations more established. They took shelter on reedy islets, feeding on fish, frogs, and whatever could be gathered. Hunger and humiliation stalked them. Yet within this hardship, their cohesion deepened. The lake itself became both adversary and ally. Texcoco was not a uniform body of water. Its northern shallows turned brackish, while its southern reaches were fresh. Seasonal rains swelled its volume, flooding shorelines and marshes. To live upon it required ingenuity. The Mexica learned to weave reeds into mats that floated upon the water. By layering mud and sediment, they created artificial plots, primitive chinampas, that could yield maize, beans, and squash. These gardens, lashed to the lakebed with stakes, turned swamp into sustenance. Daily life revolved around water. Children paddled canoes from an early age. Women fished with nets, roasted waterfowl, and ground maize on stone metats balanced inside their reed huts. Men patrolled in dugouts, spearing axolotls and turtles. Everything was precarious, but everything was used. This adaptation, born of necessity, hinted at a future strength. The Mexica's ability to thrive where others saw only wasteland. Could a people who made gardens out of swamp one day make an empire out of rejection? Despite their ingenuity, the Mexica remained politically vulnerable. Stronger Altepetl regarded them as nuisances, poor squatters who paid no tribute, who stole resources from the fringes. To survive, the Mexica had to negotiate constantly, some years offering service as mercenaries, other years retreating deeper into marshland to avoid reprisals. Yet prophecy guided them. Their priests spoke of a sign, the eagle upon the cactus, devouring a serpent. Until that vision appeared, their settlement was provisional, their destiny deferred. Each relocation, each rejection was measured against this promise. Tension simmered. Where others saw a ragged band of wanderers, the Mexica believed themselves chosen. They were waiting for a cosmic confirmation that the land beneath their feet was not temporary but eternal. Life among the reeds was harsh but formative. Social structures tightened. Commoners, Machihualtin, labored on chinampas, their survival tied directly to daily harvests. Emerging nobles, Pipiltin, distinguished themselves in war, consolidating authority. Priests oversaw ritual, reading omens in the sky, marking time through sacred calendars. Even amid poverty, the Mexica invested in ceremony. Festivals punctuated the year, dances, bloodletting, offerings of copal incense. These rituals gave meaning to deprivation, binding community together. One can imagine the rhythms of a day, dawn light shimmering across water, canoes setting out to check nets, smoke rising from hearths as women prepared atole, maize gruel for their families. Children fetched water in clay vessels, men sharpened obsidian blades for the next call to battle. Life was ordinary, yet every action resonated with belief that they were part of a larger cosmic migration. Still, danger was never distant. Raids from neighboring Toxcatl tested their defenses. Floodwaters threatened to sweep away their reed huts. Drought years left Chinampas barren. Survival demanded constant vigilance, and yet hardship also produced opportunity. By living on the margins, the Mexica mastered lacustrine ecology in ways their rivals often neglected. They learned which soils enriched harvests, how to manage canals, how to secure stability on unstable ground. This intimate knowledge of lake and marsh would later prove decisive when they transformed an islet into a capital city. But at this stage, their future remained uncertain. They were still a people without recognition, a people waiting for a sign. Would it come in time? Or would they vanish into the basin's crowded tapestry of forgotten towns? By the early 1320s, the Mexica clustered on a swampy islet in the western reaches of Lake Texcoco. To their rivals, it was an inhospitable place, a patch of reeds unfit for grand cities. To the Mexica, it was endurance made visible. One more temporary camp, yet perhaps the last. And then, according to tradition, the vision appeared. An eagle perched upon a prickly pear cactus, devouring a serpent. For the Mexica, this was no coincidence of nature. It was the fulfillment of prophecy, the divine confirmation that their long odyssey had reached its destined end. On that islet, they began to build. Mud and stone anchored new chinampas. Wooden posts secured foundations. A small temple was raised to Huitzilopochtli, marking the sacred center. The settlement received a name, Tenochtitlan, the place of the prickly pear cactus on stone. What began as reed huts and fragile plots would one day become a metropolis larger than most European capitals of its age. But in these first years, it was still a gamble, a city of outcasts, daring to imagine sovereignty. The Mexica's search for a home had ended, yet their struggle was only beginning. For even as Tenochtitlan took root, powerful neighbors watched. Azcapotzalco's Tepanecs demanded tribute. Culhuacan remembered betrayal. The Mexica were no longer wanderers, but they were not yet rulers. They had land. They had prophecy fulfilled. What they lacked was legitimacy, power, and allies. The prophecy had spoken. On a swampy islet in Lake Texcoco, the Mexica claimed they had witnessed the sign promised by their god Huitzilopochtli, an eagle perched upon a cactus, devouring a serpent. This vision transformed exile into destiny. From this moment, their wandering ceased. The foundations of Tenochtitlan were laid. The islet itself was far from promising. Its ground was marshy, unstable, prone to floods. Fresh water was scarce. Nearby Altepetl, Culhuacan, Azcapotzalco, and Texcoco saw little value in this patch of swamp. To the Mexica, however, hardship had always been the crucible of resilience. If no one else claimed this land, then it was theirs by divine right. They began with what they knew. Stakes of wood driven deep into mud formed platforms. Reeds woven into mats became walls, thatched roofs, and floating plots. By layering sediment and soil upon reed bases, they expanded habitable ground. Over time, these plots, chinampas, multiplied into grids, laced with canals that could be navigated by canoe. Where rivals saw swamp, the Mexica engineered farmland. It was an audacious experiment. A city not beside a lake, but rising from within it. Could such fragile foundations sustain a metropolis? Geography shaped society. With water on all sides, defense became both a challenge and a strength. Only narrow causeways connected the islet to the mainland, and these could be broken in times of war. Within the settlement, canals served as streets. Canoes replaced carts, The lake supplied food in abundance: fish, salamanders, ducks, and edible plants. Yet dependence on surrounding city-states remained. Wood for construction, obsidian for blades, and salt for preservation still had to be traded or seized. The city's layout reflected Mexica cosmology. At its heart rose a sacred precinct, oriented to cardinal directions. Here stood the earliest version of the Templo Mayor, a stepped pyramid honoring two deities at once: Huitzilopochtli, patron of war, and Tlaloc, bringer of rain. This dual dedication symbolized the balance between martial ferocity and agricultural fertility, the two forces upon which survival depended. Festivals gave life to stone. At appointed times, priests climbed temple steps carrying copal incense and drums. Offerings of food, flowers, and, increasingly, human hearts were made to sustain cosmic balance. According to Mexican belief, the sun's daily journey required nourishment. Without sacrifice, the world itself risked collapse. For commoners, these rituals were not abstract theology, but community duty. Families contributed tamales, maize, or labor. Captives taken in skirmishes were paraded through streets before ascending temple stairs. The spectacle affirmed unity. The gods had chosen this place, and the people honored the covenant. Yet daily rhythms were not consumed by ritual alone. Men worked chinampas, paddling through canals with tools of wood and stone. Women tended hearths, grinding maize into masa for tortillas and atole. Children fetched water in clay jars, learned to weave nets, or were drilled in basic discipline. Market exchanges, still modest, allowed barter of fish, chilies, and textiles. Though humble, these rhythms sustained growth. By the mid-14th century, Tenochtitlan had begun to expand beyond survival. Populations swelled as migrants from the north and displaced peoples from the basin found refuge here. Scholars estimate tens of thousands resided in the city by 1350. With growth came political organization. At the apex stood the Tlatoani, literally, the speaker. This ruler acted as both war leader and sacred intermediary. Supported by councils of nobles, Pipiltin, he adjudicated disputes, allocated land, and led campaigns. Below them, commoners, Massahualtin, formed the city's backbone, bound by tribute and communal duty. At the margins were slaves, Tlacotin, often debtors or captives, who could nevertheless earn or buy freedom. Education reinforced cohesion. Sons of nobles attended Kalmakak schools, where they studied ritual, astronomy, and rhetoric. Commoner children trained in Toxcatl, where discipline, history, and military skills were drilled. Girls learned weaving, household management, and ritual duties. Through education, identity hardened. They were no longer merely wanderers, but a people with structure, destiny, and pride. Still, threats surrounded them. Azcapotzalco, rising as a dominant Tepanec power, demanded tribute. Culhuacan, still resentful of past betrayal, eyed them with suspicion. Texcoco, though distant, loomed as a cultural and military force. Tenochtitlan's survival depended on maneuvering between these larger powers. Mercenary service continued. Mexica warriors, renowned for discipline, fought in campaigns for stronger neighbors. Payment came in maize, cotton, and occasionally land. Each battle honed their martial ethos. Valor measured not by killing, but by capturing enemies alive for sacrifice. This ethos intertwined warfare with ritual, ensuring that every campaign reinforced divine duty. Yet mercenary service carried risks. Dependence on others for legitimacy kept them subordinate. Could Tenochtitlan remain content as a client state, or would ambition push it toward autonomy? Inside the city, prosperity and hardship coexisted. Chinampas yielded impressive harvests: maize, beans, squash, chilies, and flowers in abundance. Canoes ferried goods through canals to markets, where barter thrived. Artisans carved obsidian blades, crafted shell ornaments, and wove cotton cloth. These goods gave Tenochtitlan a distinctive cultural life, even in its early phase. But the city was also vulnerable. Floods sometimes swept across Chinampas, ruining crops. Drought years brought hunger. With population growth, the pressure on food supplies intensified. Tribute from conquered or allied towns became essential to stability. Each expansion of population deepened the need for conquest, laying the foundations of an imperial system not yet fully conceived. Society reflected strict hierarchy. Nobles wore cotton cloaks dyed with cochineal, while commoners dressed in plain maguey fiber. Feasts for the elite included cacao drinks and turkey, luxuries beyond most households. Musicians and poets adorned noble courts with songs that celebrated gods and rulers. Yet beneath hierarchy, cohesion endured. All Mexica shared devotion to the gods and pride in their chosen city. The city itself grew into spectacle. Causeways of packed earth connected the islet to shore, enabling trade and defense. Wooden aqueducts brought fresh water from springs, solving one of the islet's greatest challenges. Bridges spanned canals, raised when enemies threatened. From the lake, Tenochtitlan appeared as a gleaming jewel. Temples rising above shimmering water, canoes bustling through channels, chinampas forming a green mosaic across the surface. Visitors from neighboring Altepetl were struck by the sight. What had been dismissed as worthless swamp was becoming a formidable city. Suspicion gave way to unease. Could this once wandering people rise beyond service to claim sovereignty? Yet cracks appeared even in ascent. Rivalry simmered within noble houses. Commoners burdened by tribute sometimes fled to neighboring towns. Outbreaks of famine tested loyalty. And above all, dependence on mercenary service meant Tenochtitlan's fate was tied to wars it did not control. Still, resilience endured. Each hardship reinforced a collective conviction. They were the chosen of Huitzilopochtli, the people who had seen the eagle on the cactus. Their city, precarious as it seemed, was destined for greatness. But greatness demanded more than prophecy. It required power, and power would come not from reeds and chinampas alone, but from alliances, betrayals, and wars that would reshape the Valley of Mexico. The Mexica had founded their city. Now, they would have to defend it, against enemies, against hunger, against the weight of history itself. Would Tenochtitlan remain a client city, feeding on scraps from its neighbors? Or could it rise to command the basin, rewriting the balance of power? The city was founded, but it was not free. In the early decades of the 14th century, Tenochtitlan existed in the shadow of greater powers. The Tepanec state of Azcapotzalco dominated the western lakeshore, commanding tribute from weaker Altepetl. Culhuacan, once a rival patron, eyed the Mexica with lingering distrust. Texcoco on the eastern shore, heir to Toltec prestige, cast a long cultural shadow. Tenochtitlan was the newcomer, resourceful, yes, but still precarious. Its survival depended on service. Azcapotzalco demanded obedience. Its ruler, Tezozomoc, understood the value of Mexica warriors. Hardy, disciplined, ruthless. In exchange for protection and limited autonomy, Tenochtitlan provided tribute and military service. The arrangement suited Azcapotzalco. It suited the Mexica too. For a time. On the battlefield, the Mexica honed their reputation. Unlike European armies of the same era, their campaigns sought not annihilation, but capture. Prisoners were paraded home for ritual sacrifice, each heart a gift to Huitzilopochtli, each captive proof of valor. The macuahuitl, a wooden sword edged with obsidian blades, could maim without killing, enabling the capture of living enemies. This martial ethic infused society. Boys in Toxcatl schools learned to march in formation, to hurl atlatl darts, to bear hunger and cold without complaint. Nobles in Carmacac were taught strategy, astronomy, and the rituals binding war to the cosmos. Would such relentless preparation be enough to lift Tenochtitlan from vassalage? The rewards of service were tangible. Victorious campaigns brought maize, cotton, cacao, and sometimes land grants. Tribute poured through Azcapotzalco into Tenochtitlan, swelling its markets. The Mexica learned diplomacy as well as war, marrying into local dynasties, offering daughters to secure alliances, yet dependence rankled. Every battle fought for Azcapotzalco enriched another throne. Every sacrifice staged in Tenochtitlan reminded them they bled for others' ambitions. Inside the city, commoners bore the burden. Tribute quotas pressed heavily, baskets of maize, woven cloth, labor for temple expansion. Still, many embraced service as sacred duty. For them, warfare was not exploitation but a holy enterprise, the means by which their sun would continue to rise. Life for the ordinary soldier was austere. Campaigns meant long marches through forest and highland, carrying maize cakes for rations, sleeping beneath woven cloaks. Pay was meager. Honor, recognition, and the chance for promotion were greater rewards. A commoner who captured 4 prisoners might ascend to the rank of eagle warrior or jaguar warrior, elite orders with distinctive dress and privileges. These orders became the social ladder, offering mobility in a rigid hierarchy. To wear the feathered headdress of an eagle warrior was to be seen, in the marketplace and the temple precinct alike, as touched by divine favor. But how long could honor compensate for subordination? Meanwhile, Tenochtitlan itself matured. Markets expanded, drawing traders from across the basin. Artisans carved turquoise mosaics, shaped obsidian blades sharper than steel, wove cotton mantles embroidered with shell. The city's causeways grew sturdier, its temples taller. The Templo Mayor saw successive enlargements, each layer of stone entombing the last, as though the city were literally building atop its own past. Every expansion proclaimed ambition. Tenochtitlan was no longer a fragile outpost, but a city demanding recognition. Still, recognition did not mean independence. Azcapotzalco's grip remained firm, exacting tribute and loyalty. For the Mexica elite, the dilemma was clear: remain clients or risk rebellion. Tensions surfaced in episodes of intrigue. Chroniclers describe Mexican nobles maneuvering for marriages into Culhuacan and Texcoco dynasties, sometimes provoking suspicion from their Tepanec overlords. In these unions, legitimacy was sought, a lineage that connected them to the prestigious Toltecs, whose vanished capital at Tula remained the gold standard of civilization. Ritual sacrifice reinforced legitimacy too. Captives from campaigns were offered on Tenochtitlan's altars, their blood-staining stone steps that faced the rising sun. To neighboring cities, this spectacle signaled both devotion and menace. The Mexica were no longer a despised migrant band, but a people unafraid to display power. Yet this very spectacle deepened fear. Could such ferocity ever remain subordinate? The life of commoners reflected the duality of dependence and ambition. By day they labored in chinampas, harvesting maize, beans, and flowers. By night they gathered in calpulli, communal wards, for feasts of tamales and pulque, a fermented maguey drink. Musicians played drums and flutes. Storytellers recited epics of migration and prophecy. The eagle on cactus sign was retold as promise. One day, they would dominate the valley. Even games carried martial undertones. Ullamalistli, the rubber ball game, was more than sport. It was ritualized combat, a test of agility and stamina. Winners gained honor, sometimes even captives' lives. For young warriors, the ball court was training ground for battlefield discipline. The cracks in Tepanec dominance widened as Tezozomoc aged. His long reign, remembered for cunning and expansion, kept the balance, but succession bred uncertainty. Would Azcapotzalco's heirs maintain control, or would rival cities exploit the transition? Tenochtitlan waited, sharpening its blades. Inside its temples, priests whispered prophecies. Huitzilopochtli had not chosen them for servitude. The eagle had landed not to feed Azcapotzalco's throne, but to elevate Tenochtitlan's. The question grew unavoidable. When the moment came, would the Mexica seize independence? That moment approached in the early 15th century. A dispute over succession in Azcapotzalco erupted after Tezozomoc's death. Rival claimants weakened Tepanec unity. Texcoco, long overshadowed, stirred under its exiled prince Nezahualcoyotl, dreaming of return. The valley's balance teetered. Tenochtitlan, armed with seasoned warriors, stood ready. For nearly a century, they had fought others' wars, filling others' coffers, feeding others' gods. Now, history offered a chance to fight for themselves. The next battles would not merely secure tribute or honor. They would decide whether the Mexica remained mercenaries or became masters. Would Tenochtitlan grasp the prize? The stage was set for revolt, alliance, and the birth of empire. The death of Tezozomoc in 1426 cracked open the balance of power across the Valley of Mexico. For decades, Azcapotzalco had held sway, exacting tribute and obedience from its neighbors. Now, with its patriarch gone, the Tepanec capital was consumed by rivalry. Competing heirs, Maxla chief among them, jostled for supremacy. The once mighty empire trembled. In that turbulence, the Mexica saw their chance. For nearly a century, Tenochtitlan had been a client of Azcapotzalco, supplying warriors, food, and captives for sacrifice. But ambition could no longer be contained. Maxla's heavy-handed rule alienated subject towns, squeezing them with tribute and executing rival nobles. Most dramatically, he targeted Texcoco, driving its legitimate ruler, Nezahualcoyotl, into exile. Nezahualcoyotl became a wandering prince, moving in disguise, plotting his restoration. His vision was not only to reclaim Texcoco, but to create a new balance of power. The Mexica, emboldened by prophecy and hardened by service, became natural partners, and a third ally awaited, Tlacopan, a smaller Tepanec city seeking survival against Maxtla's ambitions. Together, they forged an audacious pact. The terms of the Triple Alliance, sealed around 1428, were deceptively simple: a mutual offensive against Azcapotzalco, followed by a division of spoils, 2 parts for Tenochtitlan, 2 for Texcoco, 1 for Tlacopan. Behind this arithmetic lay a vision, not merely the defeat of one enemy, but the foundation of an empire built on cooperation and fear. The war that followed was swift and brutal. Mexica warriors, schooled for generations, marched beside Texcocan exiles and Tlacopan levies. Maxtla's forces faltered, undermined by internal dissent. Siege engines of wood and fire battered Azcapotzalco's defenses. Within months, its walls collapsed, its temples fell silent. The once dominant Tepanec capital was reduced to ruins. The valley's center of gravity shifted overnight. For the Mexica, victory was more than survival. It was vindication. They had risen from despised wanderers to partners in conquest. At Tenochtitlan, celebrations filled canals with canoes, drums echoed from the temple precinct. Captives were paraded to altars. The gods had confirmed their chosenness, but the alliance was not mere ritual. It was structure. From the ruins of Azcapotzalco, the Triple Alliance divided territory, installed tributary governors, and codified obligations. Cities across the basin were compelled to deliver maize, cotton, cacao, feathers, jade, and captives. This redistribution transformed Tenochtitlan. Tribute warehouses swelled with goods, markets thrived with luxuries. Artisans worked turquoise mosaics and gold ornaments. Commoners, who once knew only subsistence, now glimpsed abundance, though most wealth flowed upward to nobles and priests. The alliance's leadership reflected balance and tension. In Texcoco, Nezahualcoyotl re-established his throne, remembered not only as a warrior but as a philosopher king, patron of poetry and aqueducts. In Tlacopan, rulers managed tribute collection, securing their slice of power. But in Tenochtitlan, the Tlatoani Itzcoatl emerged as the pivotal architect. Itzcoatl understood that empire required more than arms. It required memory. Under his reign, Mexica elites commissioned codices that reinterpreted history. They elevated their Toltec inheritance, recasting Aztlán migrations as divine destiny. Rival narratives were suppressed, burned, or rewritten. The past itself became propaganda, ensuring that future generations would see Tenochtitlan's supremacy as inevitable. Was this manipulation of memory a gamble, or the secret of their durability? Under the alliance, campaigns multiplied. Beyond the valley, armies struck into the highlands of Puebla, the fertile valleys of Morelos, and the Gulf Coast plains. Each conquest brought captives for sacrifice, tribute for markets, and prestige for warriors. The empire grew not as a single state, but as a network of subjugated towns bound by fear, ritual, and tribute quotas. Daily life in Tenochtitlan reflected this expansion. Markets overflowed with cacao beans, now serving as currency. Merchants, the Pochteca, ventured to distant lands, returning with jade, tropical birds, and jaguar pelts. Women wove cotton mantles dyed in brilliant hues, worn by nobles in ceremonies that displayed wealth and rank. Warriors feasted on turkey and drank chocolate, while commoners still subsisted on tortillas, beans, and chilies. The city's urban fabric grew ever more magnificent. Causeways widened, aqueducts of stone and wood carried fresh water, temples multiplied. By mid-century, visitors described Tenochtitlan as a vision, a city of stone rising from water, gleaming with temples, humming with commerce. Yet victory bred tensions. Tlacopan's role, though rewarded, remained secondary. Texcoco's prestige as a Toltec heir clashed subtly with Mexican ambition, and Tenochtitlan itself, flush with tribute and confidence, began to test the limits of equality. Still, for the moment, the arrangement held. The Triple Alliance proved more than a pact of convenience. It became the framework of an empire that would last a century. The human cost, however, was heavy. Conquered towns endured relentless demands. Not only tribute, but quotas of captives for sacrifice. Families watched sons and daughters marched away to altars in distant Tenochtitlan. Resistance flared in pockets, quickly crushed by punitive campaigns. Fear became as effective as stone walls. Was this sustainable empire, or an edifice built on resentment? Within Tenochtitlan, the nobility thrived. Palaces adorned with murals and gardens rose along causeways. Poetry flourished. Songs praised Huitzilopochtli and the warrior's path. Schools drilled new generations in discipline, cosmology, and martial art. Every child grew knowing the alliance had transformed their destiny. But commoners felt both pride and burden. Tribute demands filtered down, weaving quotas, construction labor, agricultural output. The city's splendor was built on their toil. Some saw opportunity, sons rising as warriors, daughters married into noble lines. Others saw only strain. Religion intensified the burden. With the alliance's victories, sacrificial spectacles multiplied. Captives from conquered towns filled altars. Festivals grew grander, bloodier. Priests declared that the sun's continued movement across the sky demanded ever more nourishment. For the Mexica, war was no longer merely survival. It was sacred necessity. Could such a system expand forever without breaking? The Triple Alliance's birth marked the moment when Tenochtitlan ceased to be one city among many and began its path toward dominance. By reconfiguring memory, subduing rivals, and binding allies, the Mexica forged the machinery of empire. But alliances, however grand, are never static. Texcoco's poets, Tlacopan's governors, and Tenochtitlan's priests all harbored ambitions. The seeds of future conflict lay hidden within this shared triumph. For now, the Mexica could look upon Lake Texcoco and see a city transformed. Warehouses brimming, temples ascending, markets alive with goods from distant provinces. From vassals, they had become rulers. From warriors of fortune, they had become architects of empire. Yet every empire must choose its course, expansion without end or stability with limits. The Mexica chose expansion. The next campaigns would push their power beyond the valley, across mountains and plains, binding dozens of provinces in tributary chains. But expansion would also bring new enemies, and among them, a city whose defiance would haunt the Mexica until the very end, Tlaxcala. What awaited the Triple Alliance beyond its first triumph, unity or fracture? The answer lay in conquest without pause. The victory over Azcapotzalco had reshaped the Valley of Mexico. Yet for the Mexica, triumph was only the beginning. Alliances secured, temples rising, markets thriving. The question became, how far could this empire reach? The answer was written in conquest. Under Toxcatl and his successors, the Triple Alliance launched campaign after campaign. Neighboring Altepetl, Chalco, Xochimilco, Coyoacan were subdued. Armies marched beyond the basin into the fertile valleys of Puebla, the hot lands of Morelos, and the tropical coasts of Veracruz. Each victory brought not annexation in the European sense, but submission. Conquered towns remained nominally autonomous, their rulers kept in place, so long as they delivered tribute and captives. This system multiplied rapidly. By mid-15th century, dozens of provinces were bound to Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan. Tribute lists recorded in later codices detail staggering quantities: bales of cotton cloth, cacao beans by the tens of thousands, shields, feathered headdresses, jaguar pelts, obsidian blades, maize, honey, and salt. The empire was not a map of borders, but a network of obligations, a web whose strands reached from Pacific to Gulf. The machinery of tribute shaped every life. Merchants, the Pochteca, became vital arteries. Organized in guilds, they traveled great distances, often disguised as traders, while gathering intelligence for the state. Protected by their semi-sacred status, they returned with turquoise from the north, quetzal feathers from Guatemala, cacao from Chiapas. Their caravans, laden with treasures, enriched Tenochtitlan's markets and stocked noble households. Tribute flowed in from provinces: cotton mantles, sandals, carved jade, foodstuffs. Warehouses near the sacred precinct overflowed, guarded by officials who recorded deliveries on painted codices. Failure to deliver tribute invited swift retribution. Punitive campaigns that reminded towns the alliance's reach was merciless. But abundance for some meant burden for many. For provincial commoners, tribute was labor extracted: weaving, harvesting, hunting, carving. Their sweat filled the stores of Tenochtitlan. Could such relentless demands endure without rebellion? Inside the capital, the effects were dazzling. Markets at Tlatelolco, Tenochtitlan's twin city, became legendary. Visitors described thousands of stalls where traders exchanged cacao beans for obsidian knives, live turkeys for cotton mantles, freshwater fish for salt cakes. Judges supervised fairness. Scribes recorded deals. By some accounts, 50,000 people thronged these markets on festival days. For nobles, tribute meant luxuries once unimaginable. Featherworkers fashioned capes of quetzal plumes shimmering green and blue. Goldsmiths hammered intricate jewelry, though gold itself carried ritual, not monetary value. Priests in cotton robes of brilliant dye conducted ever grander ceremonies, fed by the captives streaming from conquest. The city's skyline mirrored prosperity. The Templo Mayor was enlarged again and again, its twin shrines rising higher above the lake. New causeways, bridges and canals transformed mobility. Stone palaces lined avenues, adorned with gardens and carved reliefs. But was magnificence also a mask, concealing strains beneath? Daily life reflected both pride and pressure. For commoners in provinces, tribute quotas were relentless, each household weaving cloth, raising turkeys, or delivering maize for distant overlords. In Tenochtitlan, Calpulli wards organized collective labor, building canals, repairing causeways, farming chinampas. Schooling drilled children in discipline, weaving them into the fabric of empire. For warriors, expansion was both duty and opportunity. Capturing enemies in distant campaigns elevated status. Promotions to eagle or jaguar warrior orders brought land and privilege, but survival on campaign was uncertain. Long marches, thin rations, diseases in tropical lowlands. The pursuit of captives sometimes outweighed strategic logic, leaving warriors vulnerable. Women bore tribute burdens too. Hours bent over looms produced the cotton mantles that flowed as tax. Others brewed pulque, prepared food for soldiers, or served in temple rituals. Through their work, the empire's tribute system functioned. The ideological underpinning was clear. Conquest sustained the cosmos. Priests declared that the sun required nourishment, and each war fed the celestial engine. The logic was circular but potent. Wars brought captives. Captives fed sacrifices. Sacrifices ensured cosmic balance, which justified further war. Festivals embodied this cycle. At Panquetzalistli, dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, processions filled the city with banners, dances, and offerings. Captives were slain on pyramid steps, their blood painted across stone. The people cheered, for without such gifts the sun itself might falter. Yet whispers persisted. Some provinces resisted the logic, seeing tribute as exploitation, sacrifice as cruelty. Resistance brewed in valleys to the east, in Tlaxcala especially, where defiance hardened into tradition. Would this defiance remain containable, or fester into the alliance's greatest challenge? In Tenochtitlan, rulers understood the stakes. Itzcoatl's reign had been foundational, but his successors extended ambition. Moctezuma II, 1440–1469, orchestrated sweeping reforms. He imposed tribute schedules, formalized provincial administration, and expanded religious ceremonies. He also oversaw aqueduct construction, ensuring fresh water for a swelling city, and dike systems to mitigate flooding. These infrastructural feats spoke to vision as much as power. But Moctezuma I also faced crisis. In the mid-1450s, a series of devastating droughts and frosts triggered famine. Crops failed across the basin. Starvation stalked the streets. Chronicles recall people selling themselves into slavery to survive. The crisis tested both legitimacy and tribute system. Relief came only after years of hardship, forcing rulers to double down on expansion. Conquest became not optional, but existential. Thus, the empire's trajectory hardened. Survival demanded tribute, and tribute demanded endless war. The web of tribute was not simply economic. It was political control disguised as ritual necessity. Provinces bound by fear knew that rebellion would be met with annihilation. Garrisons and governors enforced order, but it was spectacle that cemented dominance. When delegations from subject towns entered Tenochtitlan's plaza to deliver tribute, they witnessed rituals on the Templo Mayor, reminders of both wealth and terror. For the Mexica elite, this system was triumph. For subject peoples, it was grievance. Each bale of cotton, each captive marched to sacrifice, planted seeds of resentment. Could this resentment one day ignite? By the late 15th century, the empire spanned hundreds of kilometers, a patchwork of tributary provinces feeding a single city. Tenochtitlan had become a capital of unparalleled grandeur in the Americas, perhaps 200,000 inhabitants, a metropolis surpassing many European cities of its time. From swamp to empire, the transformation was breathtaking. But each triumph concealed fragility. The system rested on perpetual expansion. Tribute sustained the city. Sacrifice sustained the cosmos. Should conquest falter, the edifice might crumble. And beyond the mountains, one Altepetal remained unconquered. Tlaxcala. Small, yet fiercely independent, it resisted every attempt at subjugation, serving as both thorn and training ground. Mexica rulers tolerated its survival, exploiting the flower wars to harvest captives, but its defiance loomed as unfinished business. What would happen when unfinished business collided with external forces no prophecy had foreseen? For now, the empire thrived. Warehouses brimmed, temples towered, markets buzzed, warriors boasted. The Mexica believed their destiny was limitless, ordained by gods, secured by arms. Yet even in their splendor, cracks widened. Famines, rebellions, rivalries, all hinted that the web of tribute might be as fragile as the reeds upon which their first city was built. Expansion had made them mighty, but would it also make them brittle? The Triple Alliance had humbled dozens of Altepetal. Tribute poured in from distant provinces, yet one neighbor stood unbent: Tlaxcala. Nestled east of the Valley of Mexico, ringed by rugged mountains and fertile valleys, Tlaxcala was small but fiercely independent. It was not wealth that made them dangerous, but resolve. Year after year, they resisted conquest, forcing the Mexica to rethink how war itself was waged. What happens when victory proves impossible, yet battle remains inevitable? Tlaxcala's geography mattered. The basin lay high and cool, its soil rich for maize and magi. Unlike lake-bound Tenochtitlan, it was dryland territory, harder to encircle or starve. Its people were Chichimec descendants, renowned for toughness and martial skill. No single ruler commanded them. Instead, a confederation of 4 Altepetal shared governance, creating resilience against domination. Mexica rulers, beginning under Moctezuma II and continuing with Toxcatl and Tizoc, launched repeated campaigns. But each advance faltered. Tlaxcalan warriors fought ferociously with obsidian-edged spears and atlatl darts, defending their independence with pride. The Mexica faced a paradox. Defeat could not be delivered, yet neither could they retreat without loss of prestige. The answer was the Xochiaoyotl, the Flower Wars. Unlike typical campaigns for territory or tribute, Flower Wars were formalized clashes. Both Mexica and Tlaxcalans agreed upon battlefields and dates. Armies gathered, banners fluttered, drums thundering. Combat unfolded with theatrical intensity. Yet the aim was not to conquer land. It was to capture warriors alive. For the Mexica, captives meant sacrifices to feed Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc. For the Tlaxcalans, captives served their own gods, ensuring balance and demonstrating defiance. In this deadly exchange, both sides gained prestige, but neither yielded sovereignty. The spectacle had wider purpose too. By keeping Tlaxcala unconquered, the Mexica secured a training ground. Young warriors cut their teeth in ritualized combat, proving themselves before advancing to higher military orders. The wars thus became part of the empire's very structure, yet beneath ritual lay real cost. For commoners, flower wars meant fathers, brothers, and sons marched away, sometimes never to return. For widows and mothers, the ritualized veneer did little to soften grief. Could ritualized stalemate endure forever? Or was it sowing seeds of a more explosive reckoning? Life in Tlaxcala reflected constant readiness. Families trained sons for war from youth. Fields produced maize, beans, and chili, but much harvest sustained warriors. Women wove garments marked with distinctive Tlaxcalan designs, bold reds and whites, that set their men apart in battle. Markets bustled with obsidian and maguey products, but without access to the coastal luxuries controlled by the Mexica, scarcity was common. This hardship only hardened resolve. Chroniclers later described Tlaxcala as austere, its people lean from struggle, proud of liberty preserved against overwhelming force. Where conquered provinces groaned under tribute, Tlaxcala's defiance fostered unity. Inside Tenochtitlan, flower wars also shaped daily rhythms. Captives paraded through streets before sacrifice. Children in Karmakak schools were taught to revere the Tlaxcalan enemy, worthy foes whose blood would one day sustain the gods. Public rituals transformed battlefield losses into cosmic necessity, ensuring morale endured. But what if the gods demanded too much? By the reign of Aztectl, 1486–1502, the flower wars had become institutionalized. Aztectl, the most aggressive of Mexica rulers, expanded the empire further south into Oaxaca and Guatemala. Yet Tlaxcala remained beyond reach. Chroniclers suggest he considered total conquest, but judged the cost too high. Instead, he intensified ritual wars, harvesting captives for the rededication of the Templo Mayor in 1487, a ceremony marked, according to later sources, by the sacrifice of thousands. Such spectacles awed allies and terrified subjects, yet they also revealed dependence. Without constant war, the flow of captives might dwindle, leaving priests unable to perform rites believed essential to cosmic balance. The empire was caught in a cycle, unable to conquer Tlaxcala, yet unable to leave it alone. Meanwhile, Tlaxcala hardened its defenses, training generation after generation in guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and alliances with neighboring Otomi. They had no illusions of defeating Tenochtitlan outright, but survival was victory enough. The psychological impact of this endless war was profound. For the Mexica, Tlaxcala became both hated and honored, enemy and partner in ritual. Children grew up with stories of Tlaxcalan valor, even as they were told those same warriors must bleed on the pyramids. For Tlaxcalans, hatred of Mexica arrogance forged cohesion, sustaining their confederation through hardship. Scholars debate whether the Mexica deliberately allowed Tlaxcala to remain unconquered, valuing the steady supply of captives. Others argue failure, not choice, explained their survival. Regardless, the result was the same: a rival city-state, fiercely independent, enduring in the empire's shadow. This unresolved rivalry would have consequences beyond imagining when outsiders arrived. Yet within the Mexica world, flower wars served another function. They were cosmic theater. Priests taught that the gods themselves had waged wars at creation, capturing and sacrificing one another to set the sun in motion. Human flower wars mirrored divine precedent. To seize captives was not just strategy, but sacred duty, ensuring the fifth sun continued to rise. Festivals dramatized this cosmology. Warriors displayed captives in public, crowds jeering or weeping. Nobles hosted feasts funded by tribute, offering tamales, maize beer, and roasted turkey. After sacrifice, hearts offered to the sun, bodies sometimes divided among elite households for ritual meals. The spectacle unified city and countryside, binding awe with fear. But such dependence on ritualized violence carried a hidden cost. It made the empire inflexible, unable to adapt to new challenges without bloodshed. By the early 16th century, the flower wars were woven into the empire's very identity. Boys in Tenochtitlan aspired to take their first Tlaxcalan captive. Nobles measured prestige by their tally of prisoners. Tlaxcala, meanwhile, endured hardship with pride, knowing their very survival undermined Mexica claims of invincibility. The result was a stalemate that lasted decades. Neither side triumphed, yet both drew strength from conflict. It was a rivalry without resolution, until forces from across the ocean reshaped the equation. When Hernán Cortés and his small band of Spaniards marched inland in 1519, Tlaxcala still stood unbowed. Decades of war had sharpened their hatred of Tenochtitlan, and when faced with invaders wielding steel and horses, they faced a choice: fight another hopeless war, or turn their ancient rivalry into alliance. That decision would alter the fate of an empire. For now, in the years before contact, the Mexica and Tlaxcalans remained locked in their deadly dance. Captives climbed the steps of pyramids. Banners fluttered across battlefields. Both peoples believed they fought to sustain the cosmos itself. But the unresolved tension, ritual war without conquest, enmity without resolution, left the empire vulnerable. When foreign sails appeared on the Gulf, the Mexica would face not only invaders but also the weight of old enemies waiting for vengeance. The flower wars had given them glory. Would they also give them ruin? At the turn of the 16th century, the empire stood supreme. From the Gulf Coast to the Pacific shores, hundreds of Toxcatl paid tribute. Warehouses brimmed with cacao, jade, cotton, and foodstuffs. The Templo Mayor towered above Tenochtitlan, its twin shrines dominating the skyline. The Mexica had fulfilled their prophecy, or so it seemed. Then came a ruler whose name would echo across centuries. Moctezuma II, remembered to history as Moctezuma II. Moctezuma assumed power in 1502, following the death of Ahuitzotl. Educated in the Calmecac, trained as a warrior and priest, he embodied both martial and sacred authority. His coronation festival lasted days, marked by feasts, dances, and sacrifices of captives from recent campaigns. Tribute flowed in to honor the new Huitlatawani, the Great Speaker. But from the outset, Moctezuma ruled differently than his predecessors. He tightened the divide between nobility and commoners. Whereas earlier emperors had mingled more freely, Moctezuma withdrew into ceremony. Audiences required layers of protocol. Courtiers bowed, eyes lowered, never meeting his gaze. Chroniclers describe nobles entering barefoot, sweeping the ground before him, a ritual of awe that distanced ruler from ruled. Was this majesty or isolation? Moctezuma pursued expansion aggressively. Armies marched south into Oaxaca, east toward the Huastec, and west to coastal Michoacán. Tribute demands intensified. Provinces supplied ever greater quantities of cotton mantles, maize, and luxury goods. Captives streamed into Tenochtitlan, feeding sacrifices that punctuated the calendar. The empire at its zenith stretched hundreds of kilometers, a patchwork of tribute-paying states. Yet at its edges, resistance festered. Tlaxcala remained unconquered, a perpetual thorn. In distant provinces, governors faced riots and covert rebellions. To maintain control, Moctezuma appointed imperial inspectors, Calpixca, who monitored tribute deliveries and punished defaulters with ruthless severity. The empire seemed unstoppable, but beneath its triumphs lay tension. Could tribute demands outpace the patience of subject peoples? Inside Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma oversaw transformations that dazzled visitors. He expanded the royal palace into a sprawling complex with hundreds of rooms, gardens, aviaries, and menageries filled with exotic animals. Panthers, eagles, and serpents were housed in carefully tended enclosures, tended by specialized keepers. This spectacle of power underscored the empire's reach. If jaguars from the tropics could be brought alive, so too could distant provinces be tamed. Moctezuma also refined ritual. Ceremonies became more elaborate, sacrifices staged with greater choreography. Priests in towering headdresses processed through plazas, conch trumpets blaring, incense thick in the air. Captives were arrayed in costumes, sometimes impersonating gods before their deaths. To the people, these spectacles reaffirmed cosmic order. To the emperor, they projected invincibility. Yet behind the grandeur, famine again struck in 1505. Crops failed, food grew scarce. Moctezuma organized relief, importing supplies from tribute provinces, but resentment grew. Some whispered that the gods were displeased. Others blamed imperial overreach. Everyday life under Moctezuma mirrored these contradictions. For nobles, it was an era of unprecedented luxury. Palaces gleamed with carved stone, feathered cloaks shimmered in sunlight, banquets offered turkey, chocolate, and maize cakes. Nobles sponsored poetry contests, music, and ritual dances, showcasing refinement as much as martial prowess. For commoners, duties intensified. Tribute quotas grew heavier. Calpulli communities shouldered the burden of weaving cloth, growing maize, or raising turkeys. In the markets, cacao beans and cotton mantles circulated as currency, yet prices rose with scarcity. Labor on public works, canals, dikes, temples consumed time and energy. Schooling drilled children for discipline, but opportunity to rise socially narrowed under Moctezuma's stratification. Women bore tribute's hidden weight. Hours bent over backstrap looms produced the cloth demanded by tribute lists. Midwives, healers, and priestesses maintained traditions, but the tightening hierarchy reduced female public roles. The empire glittered at the top, but pressed harder on its base. Could this imbalance last? Moctezuma's foreign policy revealed both ambition and anxiety. He sent expeditions far afield, to the Gulf Coast and Isthmus of Tehuantepec, seeking control of trade routes that brought cacao, feathers, and obsidian. Yet he also faced rising hostility. Provinces chafed at tribute, resenting governors' severity. Tlaxcala and Huexotzinco taunted the Mexica with defiance. The emperor increasingly turned to omens. Chronicles report his fascination with prophecies and portents. Strange lights in the sky, temple fires, floods on Lake Texcoco. Whether these accounts were shaped later by conquest narratives remains debated, but they reflect an atmosphere of unease. Moctezuma consulted priests and diviners, interpreting events as warnings. Was the fifth sun nearing its end? Was divine wrath brewing against the empire's excesses? As the empire swelled, Moctezuma tightened central authority. He replaced many hereditary rulers in conquered towns with governors loyal to him. Tribute inspectors enforced quotas harshly, sometimes flaying rebels or razing villages. The empire grew wealthier, but also more brittle, reliant on fear rather than consent. This centralization echoed in the capital. Nobles enjoyed privileges, but depended entirely on imperial favor. Warriors strove for honor, but the path to status narrowed. The ruler's distance, cloaked in ritual, reinforced awe, but cut him off from the murmurs of unrest. Within Tlaxcala, meanwhile, warriors sharpened their obsidian blades. Flower wars continued, a ritual theater that sustained Mexica sacrifices but also preserved Tlaxcalan independence. No victory seemed possible. The paradox persisted. An emperor at his zenith, still haunted by an unconquered neighbor. Would this unfinished war one day return with consequences beyond imagining? In 1517, news arrived from the Gulf Coast. Strange vessels had been sighted, unlike any canoe, with white sails billowing. Survivors described bearded men clad in metal, carrying thunderous weapons, riding animals never seen before. Moctezuma was shaken. Could these be gods, or omens of cosmic upheaval? Scouts and merchants confirmed the sightings. Moctezuma convened councils, debated responses, and sent gifts, gold, cloaks, food, to appease these strangers. Chroniclers later claimed he believed them to be emissaries of Quetzalcoatl, the exiled god destined to return. While such interpretations are debated, the fact remains. Moctezuma faced the unknown with caution, bordering on fear. Thus, as Cortés and his companions prepared their march inland in 1519, the empire stood at once invincible and vulnerable, supreme in wealth, dazzling in ceremony, yet riddled with unrest and bound by ritual. Moctezuma II's reign crystallized the contradictions of empire. He raised Tenochtitlan to unprecedented heights of grandeur, but at the cost of harsher stratification. He expanded territory, but provoked resistance. He embodied majesty, but withdrew from his people. And as omens darkened the skies, he looked not to new strategies, but to the old logic of ritual sacrifice. The Mexica believed they had secured destiny through conquest and blood. Yet destiny was already shifting, carried across the sea by sails and steel. The stage was set. The empire stood at its zenith, yet the shadows of its decline had already arrived. In the spring of 1519, rumors spread faster than maize harvests. On the shores of the Gulf, fishermen and traders whispered of towering ships with white wings, carrying pale-skinned men clad in metal, beasts taller than deer, and weapons that thundered like storms. To peoples long accustomed to cycles of war and tribute, the stories sounded like omens. To Moctezuma II in Tenochtitlan, they sounded like prophecy. The strangers were Spaniards, Hernán Cortés and a few hundred companions, sailing from Cuba in search of wealth and souls. Yet to the Mexica and their neighbors, they were an enigma without precedent. Their steel blades cleaved where obsidian shattered. Their horses seemed monstrous. Their muskets and cannons unleashed thunder never heard on this continent. Word of their arrival raced inland along trade routes. The Posteca, merchant spies of the Mexica, reported details to Tenochtitlan. Coastal towns weighed responses. Some greeted the strangers with gifts, others with spears. Everywhere, fear mingled with curiosity. Moctezuma summoned his counselors, priests, and diviners. Chroniclers later claimed he recalled prophecies of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent deity, who in some traditions had departed eastward and was destined to return. Whether Moctezuma truly believed this remains debated, but his caution was undeniable. Should he crush the strangers at the coast, or treat them as envoys of the divine? Cortés meanwhile grasped his precarious position. He had fewer than 600 men, a handful of horses, and limited powder. Direct conquest of Tenochtitlan was impossible, but he had something just as potent: the ability to turn the Mexica's enemies into his allies. His first foothold came at Tabasco, where resistance was fierce. Spanish steel and cavalry broke indigenous warriors unused to horses and gunfire. After the battle, Tabasco leaders offered peace and gifts of women. Among them was Malintzin, later called Doña Marina, who spoke both Nahuatl and Mayan tongues. Her intelligence and linguistic skill made her indispensable. Through her, Cortés could communicate, negotiate, and manipulate. With Malintzin at his side, Cortés became not only a conqueror, but also a translator between worlds. As Spaniards marched up the coast, they founded Villa Rica de la Vera Cruz, claiming the land for the Spanish crown. They scuttled their ships, a gamble that left no path of retreat. Cortés had chosen to stake everything on the march inland. For Moctezuma, the reports grew darker. Gifts sent to placate the strangers, gold discs, feathered cloaks, cacao, only whetted their appetite. Cortés wrote to his king of a city in the lake more splendid than anything in Spain, already envisioning its fall. Moctezuma's emissaries returned unsettled. The strangers demanded submission, spoke of a far-off king, and displayed no fear of Mexica might. Yet they numbered so few. Could these men truly threaten an empire of millions? Along the march, Cortés encountered both hostility and opportunity. Some towns, weary of Mexica tribute, welcomed him as a liberator. Others resisted, only to be crushed by steel and fire. His most decisive encounter came in the Tlaxcala valley. At first, Tlaxcalans fought ferociously, unleashing waves of warriors against the intruders. Battles stretched for days, arrows darkening the skies, obsidian blades clashing against Spanish steel. Losses mounted on both sides, but Tlaxcala's leaders recognized an unexpected chance. For generations, they had resisted Mexica domination, locked in endless flower wars. Now a new force offered alliance. Better to risk partnership with the strangers than to remain alone against Tenochtitlan. In a dramatic reversal, Tlaxcala embraced the Spaniards. Thousands of indigenous warriors now joined Cortés, swelling his army far beyond European numbers. What Moctezuma had dismissed as a small band of foreigners was becoming a coalition of old enemies. Inside Tenochtitlan, anxiety deepened. Priests warned of dire omens, flames consuming temples, strange comets streaking the sky, women wailing in the night. Some chroniclers record that a two-headed man was born and sacrificed as a sign. Whether fact or legend, the atmosphere was charged with foreboding. Moctezuma wavered between hostility and appeasement. He sent further envoys, laden with gold and fine gifts, hoping to persuade the strangers to remain at the coast. But Cortés pressed inland, now bolstered by thousands of Tlaxcalan allies. Each day brought him closer to the lakes of the Mexica heartland. For the people of the empire, the approach was bewildering. Farmers in villages watched long columns pass, Spaniards in gleaming armor, horses snorting and stamping, cannons pulled by porters, Tlaxcalan warriors singing battle songs. Children stared in awe, elders muttered warnings. Some towns offered food and water, hoping to avoid reprisals. Others resisted, only to see their leaders executed and temples burned. News of atrocities spread, yet so too did tales of Spanish invincibility. What was myth? What was truth? In the fog of rumor, fear magnified reality. At every step, Moctezuma hesitated. His counselors urged decisive war, but the emperor, steeped in omens and cautious by nature, sought to buy time. He sent priests to deliver messages of welcome, gifts of gold, featherwork, and food. To Cortés, this appeared as submission. To Moctezuma, it was diplomacy rooted in cosmic caution. This gulf of perception would prove fatal. By autumn of 1519, the Spaniards and their allies reached the valley rim. From the heights near Iztapalapa, Cortés and his companions gazed upon Tenochtitlan for the first time. They saw a vision that seemed impossible. A city rising from water, its causeways stretching across the lake, its temples gleaming, its markets vast. To Spaniards, it rivaled or surpassed anything in Europe. To Cortés, it was a prize beyond imagining. Within days, the march would carry them across the causeways and into the sacred heart of the Mexica world. The first contact between Spaniards and Mexico was no clash of armies, but a meeting of worlds steeped in misunderstanding. Each side carried its own assumptions. Spaniards believed in conquest for crown and cross. Mexica rulers believed in cosmic cycles and ritual diplomacy. Each misread the other, setting the stage for conflict neither could fully control. When Moctezuma and Cortés finally stood face to face, the empire was at once at its zenith and already under siege, not by weapons alone, but by doubt, alliances, and the weight of prophecy. On November 8, 1519, two processions converged on the causeways of Lake Texcoco. One came from the west, Hernán Cortés and a column of Spanish soldiers, their steel glinting, banners fluttering. flanked by thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors singing in unfamiliar cadence. The other came from the east, Moctezuma II, carried on a litter of gold and feathers, surrounded by nobles, priests, and guards in resplendent regalia. History would forever pivot on their meeting. The setting was the great causeway leading into Tenochtitlan, with the shimmering lake stretching on both sides. Canoes glided across the water, drums sounded from distant temples, and the city itself rose like a vision. White plaster walls, pyramids crowned with shrines, gardens and palaces scattered across islands. For the Spaniards, the sight was beyond imagining. Bernal Diaz del Castillo would later write of their awe. "We were struck dumb at the sight of such grandeur." For Cortés, this was both marvel and prize. For Moctezuma, the encounter was no less extraordinary. He faced men unlike any he had ever seen, with skins pale, beards thick, armor bright, and animals monstrous. Yet he carried himself with ceremony, embodying the majesty of the Mexica state. Accounts differ in detail, but most agree on the scene. Moctezuma descended from his litter, his nobles shading him with canopies of turquoise and feathers. He wore a diadem of jade and turquoise, sandals adorned with gold, his cloak woven of the rarest fibers. No one touched him, for his body was considered divine. Cortés dismounted his horse and approached. Through Malintzín's translation, formal words were exchanged. Moctezuma welcomed the strangers to his city, declaring that they had been awaited, perhaps even foretold. Cortés replied that he came in service of a mighty king across the sea and that they should speak as friends. The misunderstanding ran deep. For Moctezuma, the welcome was part of ritual diplomacy. Foreign rulers or envoys were greeted with ceremony, gifts, and temporary lodgings, binding them within networks of obligation. The Mexica cosmos revolved around reciprocity, tribute, exchange, balance. For Cortés, the welcome was interpreted as submission. In European eyes, the ruler had acknowledged his superior. Gifts of gold were not tokens of courtesy, but signs of surrender. Thus, in a single moment, both sides believed they had achieved advantage. Both were mistaken. Escorted into Tenochtitlan, the Spaniards crossed causeways and entered through ceremonial gates. Crowds lined the streets, silent but curious. They passed markets brimming with goods, canals filled with canoes, temples soaring above plazas. To European eyes, it was a metropolis rivaling Seville or Constantinople. Moctezuma lodged them in the palace of his father, Toxcatl, near the ceremonial center. Rooms were spacious, courtyards expansive, servants assigned to provide food and water. The Spaniards marveled at the abundance: fowl, maize, fruits, chocolate prepared with spices. Tlaxcalan allies, too, were astonished, seeing for the first time the city they had fought for generations. Yet beneath the veneer of hospitality lay tension. The Spaniards were watched closely. Their weapons unnerved the populace. Priests muttered that their presence desecrated sacred space. Moctezuma himself withdrew into ritual, torn between caution and the desire to maintain cosmic order. Inside the palace, Cortés studied his surroundings carefully. He noted the Templo Mayor towering above the city, twin shrines to Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc dominating the skyline. He observed canals functioning as streets, markets thrumming with trade, aqueducts bringing fresh water from Chapultepec. But most of all, he saw gold. Adornments gleamed in shrines, jewelry glittered on nobles, tribute stored in chambers. To his men, weary from months of marching, this wealth confirmed every dream. Moctezuma sought to contain the strangers through ritual generosity. He visited them with offerings of flowers, cloaks, and precious stones. He spoke at length, interpreted by Malintzin, of cosmic cycles and duties. He explained that the Mexica had long awaited the return of divine powers from the east. Cortés, skilled in rhetoric, responded by extolling his own sovereign, Charles V, and the Christian God. He demanded that Moctezuma renounce his idols and accept baptism. The priests recoiled at such blasphemy. Moctezuma remained silent. The gulf between the two worlds widened with every exchange. For the common people, the foreigners were both fascination and threat. Children whispered about their beards. Women marveled at their horses. Merchants wondered at their hunger for gold rather than cacao or jade. Rumors spread of their arrogance, their disdain for the gods, their insatiable appetites. Tensions erupted when Spaniards, exploring the ceremonial precinct, attempted to climb the Templo Mayor and defiled sacred spaces. Priests protested, crowds gathered angrily. Moctezuma intervened, urging calm, but the strain was evident. Inside his own palace, he withdrew further, avoiding direct confrontation. Chroniclers describe him fasting, consulting diviners, searching omens. He seemed trapped by hesitation, paralyzed between war and peace. Cortés, recognizing both the grandeur of the city and the fragility of his position, made a bold move. He resolved to seize Moctezuma himself, holding the emperor as a hostage within his own palace. The scheme unfolded with shocking audacity. Spaniards stormed the royal quarters, confronting Moctezuma with accusations of plotting against them. Faced with armed men and uncertain loyalty from his own guards, the emperor yielded. He was escorted under guard to the Spaniards' residence, still treated with respect, still addressed as ruler, but no longer free. This act stunned Tenochtitlan. The Huey Tlatoani, embodiment of divine authority, had been reduced to a captive guest. Yet Moctezuma urged his people to remain calm, to accept his presence in the Spaniards' palace as voluntary. Perhaps he believed he could manage events, preserve the city from destruction, or buy time. But the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. The Spaniards, once guests, were now masters of the emperor himself. For weeks, this uneasy arrangement endured. Moctezuma continued to appear in public, carried on his litter, issuing orders as though nothing had changed. But all knew the truth. His words came under Spanish watch. Tribute flowed not only to the empire but also into Spanish hands. Gold was melted down into bars, packed for shipment across the sea. Among the populace, resentment boiled. How long could the city tolerate foreign occupiers in its sacred heart? The meeting of Moctezuma and Cortés was thus no singular handshake, no isolated event, but the opening of an occupation. It revealed the gulf between ritual hospitality and imperial ambition, between cosmic caution and pragmatic audacity. Each side thought they had secured advantage, Moctezuma through containment, Cortés through capture. In reality, they had entered a spiral neither could fully control. By the end of 1519, the Spaniards held the emperor within their quarters, but they were surrounded by a metropolis of hundreds of thousands. The lake glistened, the temples soared, and the people watched, their patience thinning. When the first sparks of rebellion ignited, the fragile arrangement would collapse into violence. Spring of 1520. The Spaniards had occupied Tenochtitlan for months, holding Moctezuma II under guard in his own palace. They walked the markets, demanded gold, and preached of their foreign god. The emperor, though outwardly compliant, grew increasingly withdrawn. His nobles seethed in silence. The city trembled under the weight of unresolved tension. Then came the festival of Toxcatl, a ceremony of music, dance, and sacrifice dedicated to Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror. It was one of the most important rituals of the Mexica calendar, a time when nobles and warriors gathered in the sacred precinct to honor the god who embodied fate, power, and destiny. What began as celebration would end in slaughter. As preparations unfolded, Cortés was absent. He had marched eastward with a detachment to confront rival Spaniards landing in Veracruz, led by Pánfilo de Narváez. In his stead remained Pedro de Alvarado, a fiery, ambitious officer. Distrustful of Mexica ceremonies, fearful of revolt, and tempted by the wealth he saw displayed, Alvarado made a fateful decision. On the appointed day, thousands filled the plaza. Warriors danced in shimmering regalia, their movements precise, spiraling, invoking the god. Drums thundered like a heartbeat, conch trumpets blared. Gold ornaments gleamed, feather cloaks swirled. Obsidian blades were sheathed as protocol dictated. Without warning, Spanish soldiers sealed the exits. Steel swords unsheathed, muskets leveled. Then came the attack. The massacre was swift and merciless. Nobles fell first, cut down before they could draw weapons. Drums fell silent as drummers were struck down. Warriors in brilliant costumes collapsed on the stone slabs, their feathers stained red. Mothers wailed, children scattered. Priests tried to shield sacred images but were butchered. Alvarado's men looted ornaments, hacked at cloaks for embedded gold, and desecrated the ritual space. Blood pooled on flagstones meant for sacrifice to the gods, now filled with the dead of Tenochtitlan itself. For the Mexica, this was not merely murder, but sacrilege of the highest order. A sacred festival had been profaned in the heart of the ceremonial precinct. Rage spread through the city like fire in dry maize fields. Survivors staggered into the streets telling of betrayal. Crowds armed themselves with slings, spears, and obsidian blades. Canoes blocked canals, causeways were barricaded, supplies were cut off. Spaniards who had once wandered freely now found themselves besieged. Inside their palace, Alvarado and his men realized the enormity of their deed. They had slaughtered unarmed celebrants in the holiest plaza of the empire. Now tens of thousands surrounded them, thirsting for vengeance. When Cortés returned victorious from defeating Narvaez, he entered a city transformed. Once curious crowds now hurled stones. Food ceased to arrive. Drums of war replaced the rhythms of ritual. To contain the fury, Cortés turned again to his captive emperor. Moctezuma was ordered to address his people from the palace rooftop, urging calm, reminding them of tribute obligations, asking them to allow the Spaniards to remain. The crowd responded with silence, then with jeers, then with stones. Chroniclers differ. Some say Moctezuma was struck down by his own people, others that Spaniards killed him when he ceased to be useful. What is certain is that the Huey Tlatoani, once divine embodiment of the sun, died under circumstances that shattered the sacred order. With Moctezuma's death, legitimacy collapsed. The empire had lost its axis. The Mexica rose in full rebellion. From every district, warriors surged. Slingstones rained on the palace. Arrows hissed. Barricades cut supply routes. Spaniards attempted sallies, but were driven back by sheer numbers. Tlaxcalan allies fought desperately, but casualties mounted. Hunger gnawed as maize stores dwindled. Disease spread in cramped quarters. Cortés realized they could not hold Tenochtitlan. Plans for retreat formed. The infamous escape that history would call La Noche Triste, the night of sorrows. But before that flight came days of terror inside the palace. Spaniards melted gold into ingots, stuffing them into packs, each man desperate to carry wealth even as survival grew uncertain. Tlaxcalans, disillusioned by betrayal and losses, debated abandoning their foreign partners. Every hour, drums on the Templo Mayor pounded, summoning warriors. Every night, fires blazed across the city, signaling unity against the invaders. The massacre at the Templo Mayor had unleashed forces Cortés could not control. His audacity in seizing Moctezuma had given him leverage. Alvarado's brutality had destroyed it. What began as a calculated gamble ended as a citywide war. The plaza stones still ran dark with blood. The sacred precinct, once filled with songs of worship, now echoed with cries of vengeance. This was the fulcrum moment. Spaniards, though formidable in weapons, were outnumbered hundreds to one, trapped on an island city with causeways cut and enemies united. Mexica forces, though wounded by leadership loss, had rediscovered solidarity in outrage. The empire had been humiliated but not broken. For a fleeting moment, it seemed possible the Spaniards might be annihilated, their memory erased, their presence reduced to whispers of strange bearded men who came and perished. What followed would be the desperate attempt of Cortés and his allies to escape the city alive, dragging gold and wounded comrades through rain-soaked darkness, pursued across causeways, and cut down in the waters of the lake. Late June, 1520, the Spaniards were trapped in Tenochtitlan. The massacre at the Templo Mayor had turned the city into a battlefield. Moctezuma II was dead. Tens of thousands of warriors filled the streets, canals, and rooftops. Food was cut off, water supplies blocked, every causeway guarded. Cortés realized the truth. They could no longer hold the palace. To survive, they would have to flee. Preparations began in secrecy. Spaniards and their Tlaxcalan allies melted the gold tribute into heavy bars, easier to carry. Packs bulged with treasure, even as veterans warned that weight would mean death. Horses were readied, cannons dismantled, weapons checked. Cortés chose the night of June 30th, hoping darkness and rain would cover their retreat. But the Mexica were watching. The night fell stormy, rain pelting the city, lake waters surging. Under cover of darkness, the Spaniards filed out from the palace in silence. First went the vanguard, then Cortés and the main body, finally the rearguard with baggage and wounded. Tlaxcalan allies carried supplies, their ranks swelling the column to thousands. They moved toward the western causeway at Tlacopan, planks prepared to bridge gaps where drawbridges had been removed. The plan was perilous but simple. Cross the causeway, reach the mainland, escape into Tlaxcala. At first the silence held, but as they reached the first breaches, confusion erupted. Planks were laid across gaps, soldiers stumbling over wet wood, horses balking at the narrow crossings. The columns slowed, became tangled, then the alarm sounded. Conch shells blew, drums thundered from the Templo Mayor, fires flared across the city. From every canal and street, Mexica warriors surged. Canoes darted alongside the causeway, hurling darts, slings, and obsidian-tipped spears. From rooftops, arrows rained. The retreat had become a rout. Chaos consumed the night. Horses panicked, riders thrown into the lake. Soldiers laden with gold sank into the dark waters, dragged down by their own greed. Tlaxcalan allies fought desperately to shield the column, but numbers overwhelmed them. At the breaches, Spaniards struggled to lay new planks while under attack. Some fell into the gaps, trampled by comrades, drowned beneath the weight of armor. Canoes swarmed, warriors hauling men from the water to sacrifice later. Screams mingled with rain and drums, a chorus of desperation. In the rearguard, the slaughter was worst. Pedro de Alvarado, accused of beginning the disaster with the massacre weeks before, fought fiercely, leaping with his lance across a gap in the causeway, an escape immortalized in Spanish chronicles as the Leap of Alvarado. Whether exaggerated or not, it became legend. By dawn, only fragments of the columns staggered to the mainland. Survivors collapsed in mud and reeds, armor rusting, wounds raw, eyes hollow. The toll was devastating. Of roughly 1,000 Spaniards who had entered Tenochtitlan, nearly half were dead. Thousands of Tlaxcalan allies perished. All but a handful of horses were gone. Artillery, supplies, and treasure were lost beneath the waters of Lake Texcoco. The survivors wept beneath a grove of ahuehuete trees near Tlacopan. Chroniclers remembered Cortés himself sobbing openly, overcome by grief. Hence the name, La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. Yet even in disaster, survival carried momentum. The Mexica had inflicted immense losses, but they had not annihilated the Spaniards. Cortés rallied his men, urging them toward Tlaxcala. Wounded, exhausted, they staggered through valleys and mountains, pursued by Mexica forces. Skirmishes erupted, but Tlaxcalan allies fought doggedly, determined to preserve the coalition. By July, the survivors reached Tlaxcala. There, instead of abandoning their foreign allies, the Tlaxcalan Council chose to renew the alliance. For them, the Mexica remained the greater enemy. For Tenochtitlan, victory seemed near. The strangers had fled. Their emperor was dead. The gods avenged. Yet triumph proved deceptive. Disease, carried silently in Spanish bodies, began to spread. Smallpox struck the city within months, ravaging neighborhoods, killing nobles, priests, and commoners alike. The empire's strength, renewed at the causeways, would soon be sapped from within. La Noche Triste was no mere defeat. It was a crucible that transformed Cortés's campaign. The Spaniards had tasted catastrophe, but they had also learned the city was vulnerable to blockade. The lakes were as much trap as defense, and alliances were decisive. In the coming year, they would return, not as reckless intruders, but as architects of siege. The image of survivors beneath the ahuehuete tree endures. Broken men weeping in the rain, burdened by greed, driven by desperation. Yet history did not end there. For the Mexica, what seemed a final triumph proved a fleeting reprieve. For the Spaniards and their allies, what seemed annihilation became the seed of conquest. Spring, 1521. 1 year after La Noche Triste, the Spaniards returned, not broken fugitives but hardened survivors, their ranks replenished by reinforcements, their alliances secured. Tlaxcala stood firmly at their side, determined to destroy the Mexica once and for all. Cortés had learned from defeat. This time, he would not march blindly into the island city. He would strangle it from the lakes and causeways, sever its arteries, and starve it into submission. The siege of Tenochtitlan was about to begin. Preparation was immense. In Tlaxcala, carpenters built 13 brigantines, small warships designed to dominate the lakes. Each was dismantled, carried piece by piece over mountains, and reassembled at Texcoco. Horses, cannons, crossbows, and steel were readied. Thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors swelled the army, joined by disaffected towns eager to avenge Mexica tribute demands. Cortés divided his forces. Brigantines would control the waters, while 3 columns advanced along causeways from the north, south, and west. It was a strategy of encirclement. Inside Tenochtitlan, a new Huey Tlatoani had been crowned. Cuauhtémoc, descending sun. Young, resolute, and unyielding, he rallied his people with defiance. Unlike Moctezuma, Cuauhtémoc refused diplomacy. His message was war, his strategy, to defend the sacred city street by street, canal by canal. The Mexica fortified causeways, cut breaches to trap invaders, built barricades across avenues. Canoes swarmed the waters, warriors armed with obsidian blades, atlatls, and slings. Priests invoked the gods. Sacrifices redoubled. Fires burned on temple tops. The city braced for a siege, unlike any it had known. By May, the attack began. Spanish brigantines launched from Texcoco, sails unfurled, cannons booming. For the first time, Mexica canoes faced warships armed with artillery. Canoe flotillas charged but were shattered by broadsides. The balance of the lake shifted. On land, columns advanced along causeways, hacking through barricades, laying planks across breaches. Progress was slow, contested at every step. Streets narrowed, canals cut the city into grids, rooftops became platforms for slingers and archers. Warriors hurled stones from above, women poured boiling water and hurled rubble, children jeered. Every building became a fortress. Day after day, the struggle ground on. Cortés pressed forward, only to be ambushed from behind by canoes. Brigantines countered, but could not be everywhere at once. Spaniards dragged cannons into plazas, blasting through walls, while Tlaxcalans stormed houses with obsidian and steel. Fires consumed districts, smoke rising across the lake. Casualties mounted. Mexica warriors fought with desperate courage, though weakened by famine and disease. Smallpox, carried months earlier, had already ravaged the population, killing nobles, generals, and commoners alike. Mass graves filled, yet defenders fought on. Inside Tenochtitlan, famine bit deep. The siege cut aqueducts, severing fresh water. Maize supplies dwindled. People scavenged bark, weeds, and lizards. Mothers wept as children starved. Still, the city resisted. Cuauhtémoc inspired warriors with vows to fight until the last stone, the last drop of blood. Priests proclaimed that Huitzilopochtli demanded sacrifice to repel invaders. Captured Spaniards and Tlaxcalans were hauled up the Templo Mayor, hearts torn out to the thunder of drums. Their comrades watched in horror from across the causeways as flames consumed the bodies. The message was clear. The gods still stood with Tenochtitlan. But the encirclement tightened. Brigantines patrolled canals, cutting supply lines. Tlaxcalan allies flooded districts, overwhelming defenders with sheer numbers. Entire neighborhoods were razed, houses leveled to deny cover. Slowly, inexorably, the city shrank block by block. By July, only the sacred precinct remained. The once great metropolis of perhaps 200,000 was reduced to ruins, its causeways choked with corpses, its canals clogged with wreckage. Survivors huddled in temples, starving, diseased, yet still defiant. The final assault came in August 1521. Spanish brigantines drove deep into canals, blasting defences. Infantry stormed plazas, Tlaxcalans swarmed alleys, fires consumed shrines. Cuauhtémoc fought to the end, commanding warriors until his capture in a canoe as he sought escape across the lake. Dragged before Cortés, the young emperor spoke with dignity. "I have done all I could to defend my people. Take my knife and strike me." Cortés refused, but the war was over. The fall of Tenochtitlan was apocalyptic. The city lay in smouldering ruin, temples toppled, palaces reduced to rubble. Tens of thousands were dead from war, famine, and disease. Survivors staggered through wreckage, their empire shattered. For the Spaniards and their allies, it was triumph. The greatest city of the Americas brought low. For the Mexica, it was cataclysm, the end of an age, the collapse of a cosmos sustained by centuries of ritual and sacrifice. The siege was not merely conquest by arms, it was a convergence of forces, alliances forged through enmity, disease carried across oceans, hunger wielded as weapon, technology amplifying violence. It was also a story of human resilience, of Mexica warriors who resisted against impossible odds, of Tlaxcalans who saw an opportunity to avenge oppression, of Spaniards who endured defeat yet returned with ruthless determination. The lakes of the Valley of Mexico reflected not only victory and ruin, but the birth of a new world, one neither wholly Spanish nor wholly indigenous. but forged in blood, loss, and survival. August 13th, 1521 marked the end of the siege, the capture of Cuauhtémoc, and the collapse of the Mexica Empire. Yet the story did not end in the ruins. The rubble of Tenochtitlan would soon give rise to a new city, Mexico City, capital of a colonial order that reshaped the hemisphere. But before that transformation, there was silence, smoke drifting above the lake, bodies floating in canals, temples smoldering. A city once called the Venice of the New World, reduced to ashes. August 13th, 1521. The smoke still rose above Lake Texcoco. The sacred city of Tenochtitlan lay in ruins. Canals were choked with bodies, temples toppled, neighborhoods burned to ash. Silence hung heavy where once 200,000 voices had filled plazas with trade, ritual, and song. The conquest was complete, but what followed was no return to order. It was a transformation that reshaped a continent. For the Mexica, the fall was more than military defeat. It was the collapse of a cosmic order. Their gods had not protected them. Rituals had failed. Disease had ravaged without mercy. Famine had consumed families. Survivors staggered among ruins, asking how the sun could rise when the empire that fed it lay in ashes. Cortés, meanwhile, stood triumphant, but also confronted with an immense challenge. He had destroyed a city. Now he had to build an empire. The first step was control. Mexican nobles who survived were forced into submission. Some became intermediaries, negotiating tribute and labor under Spanish command. Others were executed, accused of plotting rebellion. Cuauhtémoc, the last Huey Tlatoani, was held prisoner. His dignity unsettled the conquerors. His presence a constant reminder that the empire's spirit was not extinguished. Tlaxcalans, Totonacs, and other allies now expected reward. They had bled for victory. Many were granted privileges and exemptions. Yet they soon discovered that Spanish rule would not merely replace Mexican tribute with freedom, it would impose its own demands. The transformation began with stone. Cortés ordered Tenochtitlan leveled. Temples were dismantled, palaces torn down. In their place, Spanish churches and government buildings rose, built with the very stones of the fallen city. The Great Plaza was reshaped into a European square, its centerpiece no longer the Templo Mayor, but the foundations of a cathedral. Mexico City was born atop the ruins of Tenochtitlan, a colonial capital rising where an indigenous empire had stood. But physical change was only part of the story. Society itself was remade. The encomienda system granted Spaniards control over land and labor, binding indigenous communities into new hierarchies. Survivors of famine and war were forced into fields, mines, and workshops. Gold and silver flowed outward across oceans, feeding a global empire. At the same time, Spanish friars arrived to convert the people. Idols were smashed, temples purified, baptisms performed en masse. The Virgin Mary and Christian saints replaced Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc. Festivals were rebranded under new names, rituals adapted to Christian liturgy. A new religion emerged, not wholly Spanish, not wholly indigenous, but a fusion of both. Amid this upheaval, smallpox remained the silent conqueror. The epidemic had begun before the siege, carried by a single infected slave, and now it surged again. Entire Altepetl, once vibrant city-states around the valley, were left half-empty. Survivors faced the double blow of grief and forced labor. Population decline was catastrophic. Some estimates suggest as much as 90% of the indigenous population perished within a century. The fall of Tenochtitlan was not an isolated event. It was the beginning of demographic collapse across the Americas, a transformation more profound than any single battle. Cortés himself wrote of building not just a colony, but a new Spain. He distributed encomiendas to his men, sent treasure across the Atlantic, and demanded royal recognition. In return, Spain sent bureaucrats, settlers, and the machinery of empire. For indigenous peoples, adaptation became survival. Some embraced new faith, others clung to fragments of old tradition, weaving them into syncretic practices. Nahuatl language endured, adapted to new realities, its glyphs transcribed into Latin script by friars and scribes. Even as the empire fell, its memory was preserved, sometimes in silence, sometimes in secret, sometimes through collaboration. The ruins of Tenochtitlan became a palimpsest. Beneath every colonial church lay the stones of a pyramid, beneath every Spanish street the outlines of a Mexica canal. The past was never erased, only buried, resurfacing in legends, in codices, in the stories passed down by survivors. The aftermath also reshaped geopolitics. The fall of the Mexican Empire sent shockwaves through the Americas. Neighboring peoples saw opportunity and warning. Some sought alliance with the Spaniards, others resisted and faced the same fate. Waves of conquest followed: Michoacán, Oaxaca, Guatemala, Yucatan. The template was set: alliances, disease, steel, and faith combined to dismantle empires and erect colonies. The siege of Tenochtitlan thus marked not only the fall of a city, but the dawn of a global age, when Europe, Africa, and the Americas became bound in a single system of trade, conquest, and faith. Yet amid triumph and tragedy, human stories endured. Survivors remembered not only ruin, but resilience. Families rebuilt in shattered neighborhoods. Indigenous scribes recorded the conquest from their own perspective, ensuring their voice survived alongside Spanish chronicles. In their accounts, sorrow mingled with defiance. We ate lizards, grass, and ground maize husks. The water was bitter with ash. The stench of death filled the air. This was our end, but it was not the end. It was transformation. For the Spaniards, the conquest cemented myth. They saw themselves as new Romans, conquerors of a new world. For the Mexica, it became memory and mourning, preserved in song, lament, and codex. For the Tlaxcalans and others, it was both triumph and irony. They had toppled their enemy, only to find themselves bound by a new master. Mexico City rose as the jewel of New Spain, seat of viceroys, hub of empire, nexus of trade. Yet beneath its streets lay canals and causeways, ghosts of a city once called the Venice of the New World. The aftermath of Tenochtitlan was not a simple story of conquest. It was a collision of worlds, where destruction gave rise to creation, and where loss forged new identities. August 1521 marked the end of one empire, but also the beginning of another, the beginning of a colonial world that reshaped not only Mexico, but the entire globe. As the smoke cleared and Mexico City rose, survivors carried memories of hunger, fire, and grief. Their descendants still walk those streets, still remember the stones beneath the cathedral, still tell the story of a city that once fed the sun. History does not end with conquest. It lingers in memory, in how people choose to tell the story, in what is preserved and what is silenced. The fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521 was not only a military event, it became a tale told in two voices, one of triumph, the other of lament. Together they form the memory of Mexico. The Spaniards wrote of providence. To them, victory proved divine will. They compared themselves to Romans conquering Carthage, to Crusaders reclaiming Jerusalem. Hernán Cortés penned letters to King Charles, describing the greatness of Tenochtitlan and the righteousness of its fall. Chroniclers like Bernal Díaz del Castillo celebrated courage, hardship, and eventual glory. Their accounts framed the conquest as the beginning of a new Christian world, with Mexico City as its crown jewel. For Spain, the memory was victory, ordained by God, cementing empire. The Mexica, however, remembered differently. In Nahuatl, poems and pictorial codices, survivors recorded hunger, fire, and grief. One lament recalls, "We ate grass, salt, and lizards. We chewed the bark of trees. Water was bitter. The stench was unbearable. This was our end." Another described the city's desolation. "Broken spears lie in the roads. Our hair is in disarray. The houses are roofless, their walls red with blood." For them, memory was mourning, an elegy for a lost world, for gods who seemed absent, for families scattered by death and forced labor. Memory was also contested. The Tlaxcalans, who had fought alongside the Spaniards, preserved their own version. They were not subjects, but allies. Their chronicles emphasized their decisive role in victory, demanding recognition and privileges in the new order. Other indigenous groups reinterpreted the conquest through local traditions, some seeing it as cosmic upheaval, others as divine punishment, others as a cycle of renewal. Memory fractured into many strands. In time, Spanish and indigenous memories intertwined. Churches rose atop pyramids. Nahua scribes worked alongside friars, recording histories in alphabetic script. Oral traditions blended with Catholic liturgy. Saints took on attributes of ancient gods. Festivals merged, and the Virgin of Guadalupe emerged as a figure of syncretism. The conquest thus lived on in hybrid memory, part mourning, part triumph, part transformation. Centuries later, these memories shaped national identity. For colonial rulers, the fall of Tenochtitlan justified domination. For independence leaders in the 19th century, it symbolized resilience, Mexico reborn from conquest. For modern Mexicans, it became a paradox. Pride in the grandeur of the Mexica past, acknowledgement of Spanish heritage, and recognition of the mestizo identity forged from both. The ruins themselves became memory. Stones of the Templo Maya lay buried beneath colonial Mexico City until excavations in the 20th century brought them to light. Today, visitors walk streets where two worlds overlap: cathedral and pyramid, plaza and sacrificial altar, skyscraper and canal. The legacy extends beyond Mexico. The conquest of Tenochtitlan became a template for European expansion across the Americas. Disease, alliances, and steel combined again and again, in Peru, in the Andes, in the jungles of Central America. The memory of this first great fall echoed across continents. Yet its legacy was not only conquest, it was also resilience. Indigenous languages endure, Nahuatl still spoken by millions. Indigenous traditions survive in festivals, in foods, in art. The Mexican memory did not vanish. It adapted, weaving into the fabric of modern Mexico. Today, the story of Tenochtitlan's fall is retold in classrooms, in literature, in film, in ritual. Each retelling reshapes memory. Some emphasize Spanish daring, others indigenous resistance, others the tragedy of disease and loss. In every telling, the city remains alive, not just as ruins, but as symbols of resilience, symbols of tragedy, symbols of creation and destruction entwined. The legacy of 1521 is also global. It marked the birth of the modern world system. Silver, flowing from Mexico, fueled European wars, connected Asia through Manila galleons, reshaped Africa through intensified slavery. The conquest of Tenochtitlan was not only Mexico's story, it was the world's memory, though, remains personal. For descendants of the conquered, it is a scar carried in family stories, in songs sung quietly, in rituals adapted to survive. For descendants of the conquerors, it is a legacy of power, but also of guilt. For mestizo Mexico, it is both wound and origin story, pain and pride in equal measure. 5 centuries later, the voices of both conquerors and conquered still speak. They do not agree, but together they form the truth, a story of brilliance and brutality, of resilience and ruin, of a city that once fed the sun and then was consumed by fire. Tenochtitlan's fall was not the end. It was transformation, into Mexico City, into New Spain, into modern Mexico. Its memory lingers in stones, in words, in faces. Its legacy endures in every language spoken, every street walked, every festival celebrated in the land that was once the Valley of the Sun. History is not just what happened, it is what we choose to remember. Thus ends the story of Tenochtitlan, not as silence, but as memory. A memory that belongs not only to Mexico but to the world.